You're standing at the meat counter and you're looking at a ribeye steak. The little sticker says $18, maybe $22 a pound for one steak. I stood in that exact spot for 30 years, reaching for those shrink-wrapped trays without a second thought. And I want to tell you something right now that took me far too long to learn. The steak in that tray and the roast 3 feet to the left are the same animal, the same muscle, cut from the same rib. But one of them costs me $80 less every single time I shop. This isn't a coupon trick, and it isn't a warehouse membership. It's the way people bought beef for 100 years before somebody figured out how to charge us more for less work. I'm going to show you exactly how I do it, and near the end, I'll share a single cut of beef, documented in old butcher records, that tastes almost identical to ribeye and costs about a third of the price. You don't need special tools, a big freezer, or any skill you weren't born with. I promise, by the end of this, you'll never look at that meat counter the same way again. Let me back up and tell you how I finally caught on, because I was as stubborn as they come. It was a Saturday, sometime around the holidays a few years ago, and my grandson was coming over with his family. I wanted to do a proper prime rib, the big roast, the whole show. So I walked past the little steak trays I always bought, and I picked up one of those big boneless ribeye roasts instead. And when I got it home and set it on the cutting board, something stopped me cold. I was staring at the end of that roast, at the cross-section, and there it was. That same beautiful eye of meat, that same ribbon of fat curling through the middle, the exact shape I'd been paying $20 a pound for my whole adult life. It was a ribeye. A whole row of ribeyes, still stuck together, just waiting for somebody to run a knife between them. And I had paid $9 and change a pound for the whole thing. I stood there in my kitchen and did the math on the back of the receipt, and I actually felt a little sick, because I realized I had spent decades paying somebody else to make about 4 knife cuts that I could do myself in under 2 minutes. Let me explain what's actually going on here, because once you understand it, you can't unsee it. When a steer is broken down, it isn't cut into little steaks right away. It's cut into big sections the trade calls primals. The rib section, the one your ribeye comes from, is one solid piece. In the butcher world it has a number, and I love this detail because it sounds like something out of a filing cabinet nobody wanted you to open. It's listed in the official government meat specifications as the item that becomes your rib roast and your ribeye steaks, one and the same. Those specifications, the ones every packing house in the country follows, go back to a system the United States Department of Agriculture began building in 1927, when they started stamping grades on beef so buyers would know what they were getting. Back then, and for a long time after, most families bought beef in big pieces. A roast fed the family Sunday, and what was left got sliced and used through the week. The butcher was a person you knew by name, and he'd cut whatever you asked, thick or thin, because that was the whole job. Then something changed, and it changed fast. In the 1950s and 60s, the supermarket took over from the corner butcher. Meat started arriving already broken down, already trimmed, already portioned into those neat little foam trays under plastic. And here's the part that quietly cost you and me a fortune. Every one of those cuts, every trim, every tidy little tray is labor. Somebody has to do it, and that somebody has to be paid. So the store does the cutting, and then the store charges you for the cutting, and they charge you a premium on top of that because a small tray feels affordable and a big roast feels expensive. But affordable per tray is not the same as cheap per pound, and that little gap is where they've been eating our lunch for 60 years. Now here's where it gets interesting, because once I understood the trick, I had to figure out how to actually do it in my own kitchen without making a mess of a $100 roast, and that's where I found out how easy it really is. Let me walk you through exactly what I do, because it turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple. You go to the meat counter and instead of the steak trays, you look for the boneless ribeye roast. Some stores call it a ribeye roast. Some call it a prime rib roast when it still has the bone, and some just label it as a whole ribeye. If you don't see it out in the case, you ask the person behind the counter, and 9 times out of 10 they've got a whole one in the back, uncut, and they'll sell it to you for the roast price. That right there is the first thing nobody tells you. The uncut piece almost always rings up cheaper per pound than the same meat sliced into steaks, sometimes by $8, $9, even $10 a pound. Watch for it to go on sale around the holidays, right before the end of the year, because that's when stores discount whole rib roasts to move them. That's when I stock up. I've bought a whole boneless ribeye for under $9 a pound during that window, when the cut steaks beside it were $22. Now you bring it home, and you let it sit in the fridge until it's cold and firm, because cold meat cuts clean and warm meat drags and tears. You set it on a cutting board, fat cap up. You take your longest, sharpest knife, and you simply slice straight down across the roast, however thick you want your steaks. I like mine a good 1.5 inches thick, because a thick steak is the one luxury the store never wanted to give me without charging double. You just keep slicing, one steak after another, and every single slice you make is money going back in your pocket instead of theirs. From one whole ribeye I get somewhere between 10 and 14 steaks, depending on how thick I cut them, and they are gorgeous. Thick, even restaurant-looking steaks that would have cost me $250, $300 in trays. And I paid a little over $100 for the whole roast. That is the $80. And then some, right there, every time. But maybe you're sitting there thinking, this sounds like something only a person with a big kitchen and fancy knives could pull off. And I understand that, because that's exactly what I thought too, and I almost talked myself out of it. So let me stop and talk directly to you, the one who's sure this isn't for you. You do not need a butcher's setup. You do not need a special room or a walk-in cooler or a rack of German knives. I did my very first ribeye roast with one kitchen knife I'd owned for 20 years and a plastic cutting board from the dollar store. The only thing that matters at all is that the knife is sharp, and if yours is dull, you can fix that in about a minute with one of those little pull-through sharpeners, or even the bottom rim of a ceramic coffee mug, which is a trick my father used his whole life. You turn the mug over, and that unglazed ring on the bottom works like a whetstone. A few passes on each side, and a tired old knife bites again. If you don't have a big board, you use a rimmed baking sheet so the juices don't run onto the counter. If your hands aren't as strong as they used to be, you don't saw at it, you just let the sharp edge do the work in long, slow strokes, and you let cold meat hold its shape for you. And here's the part that makes it truly foolproof. If a steak comes out a little crooked, or thicker on one end, it does not matter one bit. It still cooks up beautiful, and it still tastes exactly the same, because it is exactly the same meat. There is no way to fail at this that costs you anything. The worst case is a slightly uneven steak that eats just as good as a perfect one. So whatever reason you've got in your head for why this is for other people and not for you, I'm telling you, from my own kitchen with my own worn-out hands, it isn't true. Now, therefore, once you've got a whole ribeye cut into steaks, you run into the next question, and it's the one that used to scare me off from buying in bulk at all. What do you do with 10 or 12 steaks so they don't go to waste? Because there's no savings if half of it spoils in the fridge, and I learned this lesson the hard way more than once in my life, throwing out good meat I'd let sit too long. Here's what I do now, and it's the same thing home cooks did for generations before the freezer aisle taught us to be helpless. You wrap each steak individually. I use a sheet of parchment or waxed paper first, folded snug around the steak, and then I wrap that in foil, or slide 2 or 3 into a freezer bag with the air pressed out. The parchment keeps them from freezing into one solid brick, so you can pull out exactly how many you need. And that little gap is where they've been eating our lunch for 60 years. If this way of thinking resonates with you, the idea that the honest, practical knowledge of how to buy and handle food got quietly buried so someone else could profit, then I want you to know I've written a lot more of it down in my book, Meat Smart. It goes deeper into the cuts, the history, and the methods that home cooks used for generations before the foam tray took over. You can find the link in the description below. Coming up next, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to take that whole ribeye roast home and turn it into steaks in your own kitchen, and I promise it is almost embarrassingly simple. Now, once you understand that gap, the next question is how to actually do it in your own kitchen, and that's exactly where I want to take you next. Wrapped like that, a steak keeps beautifully in the freezer for months, and when you want one, you move it to the fridge in the morning, and it's ready by supper. But here's the trick that genuinely surprised me, and it comes straight out of the old ways. You don't have to freeze them at all if you're willing to do something the corner butchers did as a matter of course. You can age them, right in your own refrigerator, and it makes cheap-bought beef taste like the expensive steakhouse cut. Let me explain, because this is where it gets good. When beef sits in cold, dry air for a stretch of days, two things happen. Some of the moisture leaves, which concentrates the flavor, and the meat's own natural enzymes go to work quietly breaking down the tough fibers, making it more tender, and giving it that deep, nutty, almost buttery taste that people pay a fortune for at high-end restaurants. That's what dry aging is, and it is not some modern invention. It's the oldest way there is. Before refrigeration was even common, hanging beef to age in a cold cellar or a spring house was simply how you made meat better and safer to keep. The steakhouse charges you extra for aged beef because aging takes time and space and a little bit of shrinkage, and time is the one thing they know most people won't spend at home. But you can, and here's how I do it with steaks off my own ribeye. You take a couple of the steaks you cut, you set them on a rack over a plate so the air can circulate all the way around, and you leave them uncovered on a low shelf in the back of your fridge, which is the coldest, driest spot. You let them sit there for 3 to 5 days. You'll see the surface darken and dry, and that's exactly right. That's the outside forming a kind of seal, while the inside gets more tender by the hour. When you're ready to cook, you trim off that dried outer layer, you cook the steak like normal, and you taste the difference immediately. I did this the first time as an experiment, half convinced I'd ruined 2 good steaks, and my wife took one bite and asked me which restaurant I'd smuggled it home from. I told her it came out of our own refrigerator, from a roast I'd cut myself, and she didn't believe me until I showed her the rack sitting behind the milk. That's the moment it really hit me, how much we'd been giving away all those years, paying premium prices for something that time and a cold shelf do for free. But even after all of this, the cutting, the aging, the whole roast, I still hadn't found the biggest secret of all. And this is the one I've been building up to, because when I found it, I honestly sat down at my kitchen table and shook my head at how long I'd been fooled. Because there is a cut of beef, sitting in almost every supermarket in the country, that comes from the very same muscle as the ribeye, tastes remarkably close to it, and sells for about 1/3 of the price. Let me tell you how I found it, and where it comes from, because the history is the proof. The ribeye you love is the long muscle that runs along the animal's back, the one the old texts call the longissimus dorsi. Now here's the thing, nobody at the meat counter ever volunteered to me. That muscle does not magically stop where the rib section ends. It keeps right on going forward, into the shoulder section, into what the trade calls the chuck. And the first few inches of that muscle, right where the chuck meets the rib, is the exact same tender, marbled beef as your ribeye. When they cut steaks from that spot, they don't call it ribeye, because by the letter of the meat charts it's on the chuck side of the line. They call it the chuck eye steak. Some old-timers and old menus called it the Delmonico, after the famous New York restaurant that made its name on beef back in the 1800s. The National Livestock and Meat Board, The outfit that spent decades teaching Americans how to buy and cook beef laid all this out in their cutting charts generations ago, showing plain as day that the chuck and the rib share that same eye of meat right at the seam. It was never a secret to the people who actually cut meat for a living. It was only a secret to us, the ones standing on the other side of the glass. Here is why this matters to your wallet. Because that steak carries the word chuck on its label, and because chuck is known as a cheap cut for pot roast and stew, it gets priced like a bargain. I have bought chuck eye steaks for $6, $7 a pound when the ribeye 4 feet away was $20. Same muscle. Practically the same marbling in those first cuts. A fraction of the price, because of a line drawn on a chart and a word on a sticker. Now, I'll be honest with you, the way an honest neighbor should. A chuck eye is not a perfect twin of a center ribeye. Because it sits right at the border, it can have a little more connective tissue running through part of it, and each steak is a bit different, depending on exactly where it was cut. But cooked right, and I mean a hot pan, a good sear, cooked to medium rare and rested a few minutes, it delivers that rich, beefy, marbled ribeye flavor at a price that feels like a mistake in your favor. I serve these to guests who eat steak at restaurants that charge $60 a plate, and not one of them guessed it wasn't a ribeye. Not one. And when I told them what I'd paid, the whole table went quiet the same way I did the first time. So here is how I put the whole thing together now, the complete method that saves me that $80 and often a good deal more every single time I shop. When whole boneless ribeye roasts go on sale, especially around the end of the year, I buy one, I bring it home, and I cut my own thick steaks, saving myself the $8 or $9 a pound the store charges, just to slice it. I wrap what I won't use soon and freeze it in single steaks with parchment between them. And for the rest of the year, for everyday steak nights, I buy chuck eye steaks, and I never pay ribeye prices at all, because I know they come from the very same muscle. And when I want to make any of it taste like a steakhouse, I let it age a few days on a rack in the back of my own cold refrigerator, the way people did before anyone thought to sell us the idea that better beef had to come from somebody else's cooler. None of this requires a single thing I didn't already own. A sharp knife, a cutting board, a cold refrigerator. The same 3 things sitting in your kitchen right now. I think about the years I spent reaching past the roast for the little tray, trusting that the price on the sticker was just the price, that somebody had already figured out the cheapest fair way for me to buy a steak. Nobody had. They'd figured out the most profitable way to sell me one, and those are not the same thing, not even close. The knowledge of how to buy a whole cut and break it down at home wasn't lost because it stopped working. It works exactly as well as it ever did. It faded because it was inconvenient for the people selling us the trays, and convenient for us to forget, one generation at a time, until most of us couldn't tell you where a ribeye even sits on the animal. But it never actually went away. It sat right there in old cookbooks and government charts and the memory of every butcher who learned the trade before the foam trays took over. And now it's sitting with you. If you take one thing from me today, let it be this. The store is not selling you meat. It's selling you the cutting, the wrapping, the convenience, and the comfortable idea that you couldn't possibly do it yourself. You can. You always could. And the moment you pick up that whole ribeye instead of the tray, or reach for that chuck eye steak knowing exactly what it really is, you take a little bit of that power back, one shopping trip at a time. I recovered something I didn't even know had been quietly taken from me, and I'd bet you've been missing it too, without ever being told it was gone. If you're the kind of person who's always suspected that the simple, honest way of doing things got shoved aside so somebody else could pad their margins, then you and I think alike, and you're in the right place. So let me ask you something specific, and I really do want you to answer. Have you ever bought a chuck eye steak, and if you have, did anyone at your table ever guess it wasn't a ribeye? Tell me down in the comments, and while you're there, Tell me where you're watching from, because I love seeing how far this old knowledge is traveling. If you found this useful, subscribe and join the rest of us who are digging up the practical, honest methods that got buried under 60 years of convenience and clever pricing. Because next time, I'm going to show you the forgotten way to turn the cheapest, toughest cut in the whole meat case into something so tender you can cut it with a fork, using nothing but salt, thyme, and one thing you already throw in the trash every week. Don't reach for that little tray again until you've tried what I just showed you. Your wallet and your dinner table will thank you for it. This video showed you the idea, but to do it at your own counter, come inside the Old Ways Society, where I pick up right where this video stopped and walk you through the whole ribeye roast, cut by cut. And there you can ask me directly, and I answer you myself. No machine. Old Ways folks like you are already there beside you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel anytime.